Get off the plane!" The words felt like a slap. 10-year-old Lorenzo stood frozen, his hands clutching his backpack, eyes wide with disbelief. What had just happened? He had barely spoken a word during the flight. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to disrupt the peace. Yet here he was in the middle of a packed plane with a flight attendant pointing toward the exit door. The words cut through the air, heavy and unforgiving. "You're disrupting the flight." The flight attendant barked, her voice sharp and pointed as if she were disciplining a child who had broken a rule he didn't even know existed. The passengers around them seemed to hold their breath, staring at the scene unfolding in eerie silence. Some exchanged nervous glances while others just stared with wide eyes, not knowing how to react. Lorenzo hadn't shouted. He hadn't misbehaved. All he had done was lean forward to reach for the book tucked away in his backpack, eager to pass the time as the plane hummed along. But somehow, in those moments, the flight attendant had decided that his simple action was enough to warrant being thrown off the plane. Thrown off the plane. The words bounced around in his head. He felt his heart race in his chest, a cold sweat forming on his forehead. He looked up at his aunt Belinda, sitting beside him. Her eyes met his, filled with a mix of confusion and concern. Her brow furrowed as if she couldn't quite understand what was happening either. "Please," Lorenzo whispered, his voice cracking. "What did I do wrong?" Belinda, always the calm and steady presence, glanced at him and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetie," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth, though there was a noticeable edge of confusion. "Just sit tight, okay? We'll figure this out." But the flight attendant was already advancing toward them, her eyes narrowing. "You need to get off the plane now," she insisted, her voice rising with increasing authority. "Now!" The final word rang out, sharp and cold. Lorenzo's stomach twisted. Was this really happening? Why? He couldn't understand. He wasn't being loud. He wasn't causing any trouble. He had done nothing to deserve this. The other passengers on the plane looked on, some in discomfort, others unsure of what was happening. Lorenzo caught the eyes of a few people, their gazes filled with pity, disbelief, or just a quiet hope that the situation would resolve itself. But no one spoke up. No one intervened. The silence felt heavy, suffocating, like no one dared to make a sound. "She's just doing her job," one person muttered under their breath. But Lorenzo could tell that even they weren't sure what was happening. Belinda rose from her seat, her calm demeanor slipping slightly. "Ma'am, there's been some mistake. He was simply reaching for his book. He's just a kid. You don't need to make a scene." Her voice was firm, but there was an edge of concern creeping into it now, a flicker of disbelief that had been growing ever since the moment the flight attendant had first addressed them. But the flight attendant wasn't having it. Her face was hard and cold, her posture rigid. "If you don't comply, I'll have to call security." She crossed her arms, her eyes never leaving Lorenzo's face. Lorenzo felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. Security. Was this how it was going to end? A child, removed from a plane because he had leaned forward to grab a book. The injustice of it stung. He could feel his cheeks burning with shame, his chest tightening as his heart raced. He tried to speak, to explain, but his words caught in his throat. A few other passengers had started to look around, whispering amongst themselves, but none of them seemed willing to step in. Lorenzo couldn't understand why no one was speaking up. Wasn't anyone else seeing what was happening? "Please," Belinda said again, her voice softer now, but still strong. "This is unfair. He's done nothing wrong. I'll sit with him quietly, if that's what you want. Just let us stay on the flight." The flight attendant didn't budge. "Get off the plane now." Lorenzo's heart dropped. His eyes searched Belinda's face, and he saw the mix of disbelief and frustration in her expression. It was clear that she, too, was struggling to comprehend how this was happening. But as always, Belinda remained calm, her face composed as she gently took Lorenzo's hand. Lorenzo could barely breathe. The pressure on his chest felt like a weight that he couldn't escape from. He wanted to disappear, to sink into the seat and vanish from everyone's eyes. Why was this happening? What had he done to deserve this? Was he not good enough to be treated like everyone else? Then the unexpected happened. Mrs. Willow, the elderly woman who had been sitting next to them during the flight, leaned over, her voice trembling but resolute. "Excuse me," she called out, her gaze steady and kind. "I've been sitting next to these two the entire time. There's no reason for them to be removed. He's just a boy trying to get his book." She glanced at the flight attendant, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I've seen this all. There's no disruption here." The flight attendant didn't even look at Mrs. Willow. "Please stay out of this, ma'am," she snapped, cutting her off. Lorenzo felt a small flicker of hope. Mrs. Willow had stood up for them, but it wasn't enough. The flight attendant was still resolute, her stance unyielding. The moment passed as quickly as it came. The silence grew louder in Lorenzo's ears as the other passengers turned away, unable or unwilling to speak up. It felt as though the whole world was against them. His heart was in his throat, his mind spinning with confusion and embarrassment. Belinda looked at him, her face a mask of calm determination, her eyes locking with his. "It's going to be okay," she said softly. "We didn't do anything wrong, and we won't let them make us feel like we did." Lorenzo nodded slowly, but the sting of injustice still burned in his chest. He couldn't believe that this was happening. To him, to them. But as Belinda guided him toward the exit, he felt something change inside him. Maybe it wasn't about just accepting this humiliation. Maybe it was about standing up, even when the world seemed to be pushing you down. Lorenzo's feet felt like they were made of lead as he walked through the busy airport beside Aunt Belinda. The noise around them was overwhelming. Footsteps pounding on the shiny floors, the hum of voices blending together in a blur of unfamiliar words. Travelers rushed by, some in a hurry, others taking their time, but all of them seemed so focused, so certain of where they were going. Lorenzo couldn't help but feel small, like he was part of the background, a single dot in the vast expanse of the airport. He glanced up at Belinda, his eyes wide with uncertainty. She was walking with purpose, her casual jeans and t-shirt a sharp contrast to the sharply dressed business people zipping by. Her curly hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her demeanor calm and collected despite the chaos around them. "Are you all right, buddy?" Belinda's voice cut through the noise, soft and steady. Lorenzo nodded, though it was more out of habit than actual reassurance. He felt his heart race, but not from excitement. No, his nerves had nothing to do with the adventure ahead. It was all about what had happened just moments ago. The flight attendant's harsh words, the humiliation that still stung, the weight of being treated unfairly for something he didn't even understand. "I'm just a little nervous," Lorenzo muttered, his voice quiet. Belinda smiled, a small, understanding curve of her lips. "That's normal, sweetheart. But remember, this is an exciting trip. You're going to see your dad, and you two are going to have a great time together. You've got this." Lorenzo forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The truth was, he didn't feel like he had this. His mind was still reeling from the incident on the plane. What was supposed to be an exciting first flight turned into an embarrassing ordeal. And now, as they walked through the airport, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching them. The looks from the other passengers had been hard to forget. As they moved toward their gate, Lorenzo couldn't help but notice how different he and Aunt Belinda looked compared to the other travelers. Many of them were dressed in crisp business suits or neat dresses, their faces set in expressions of determination or quiet contemplation. By contrast, he and Belinda stood out like two mismatched pieces in a puzzle. Lorenzo in his well-worn sneakers and his favorite superhero t-shirt, Aunt Belinda in a wrinkled t-shirt and faded jeans. The feeling of being out of place washed over him again, this time sharper. He tugged gently on Aunt Belinda's sleeve, his voice small. "Do you think we should have dressed up more?" Belinda looked down at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a smile that always made him feel safe. "Oh, sweetie, there's no dress code for flying. We're comfortable, and that's what matters. We've got a long trip ahead of us, and comfort is the most important thing." Lorenzo nodded, though he still couldn't shake the sense that they didn't belong. The whirlwind of things that had happened over the past few months, the arguments between his parents, the awkward silence at home, the tension in the air, had all led to this moment. He had hoped that this trip would be an opportunity for things to calm down, for things to feel right again. but instead it felt like a continuation of all the uncertainty he had been feeling. Belinda, sensing his unease, gave him a soft squeeze on the shoulder. "You're doing great, Lorenzo. It's okay to be nervous, but remember, we're in this together. No matter what, I've got your back." Lorenzo glanced up at her, her words offering some comfort. Maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe he could do this. After all, he was about to see his dad, and that thought brought a flicker of excitement into his chest, even if it was hidden beneath a layer of worry. The minutes passed quickly as they reached their gate, the noise of the airport surrounding them. Other passengers began to gather at the gate as well. Families, business travelers, tourists all standing in lines, chatting quietly with one another or staring off into space. A little girl twirled in a frilly dress, giggling as her parents snapped photos, and an older couple sat nearby, the woman reading a magazine and the man flipping through a newspaper. Lorenzo watched them all, taking it all in, feeling like an outsider looking in. This world of airports and airplanes seemed so foreign to him. The people, the noise, the movement. He wasn't used to it. He wasn't sure if he would ever get used to it. "Flight 372 to Chicago is now boarding," a voice came over the loudspeaker, jolting Lorenzo out of his thoughts. His heart raced as the announcement sank in. He was about to board a plane that would take him across the country to see his dad. This was real. He was going to see his dad. Belinda, noticing his quickened breathing, gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Deep breaths, buddy. We're in this together. It's going to be all right." Lorenzo focused on his breathing, just like Aunt Belinda had taught him, slowly taking in air and letting it out. It helped a little, but there was still that tiny spark of fear in his chest, the feeling that maybe things weren't going to go as smoothly as he had hoped. Finally, their boarding group was called. Belinda turned to Lorenzo, her face warm and reassuring. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice light, like this was just another part of the journey. Lorenzo nodded, forcing a smile as they made their way to the line. As they filed down the narrow aisle, he couldn't help but feel the buzz of nervous energy in his stomach. The plane was bigger up close, the seats closer together than they had seemed in the waiting area. The smell of stale air and the quiet hum of the engines made him feel small again, almost like he wasn't supposed to be here. But Belinda was right beside him, and for that, he felt a tiny bit better. They found their seats, and Belinda pointed to the window seat. "You can have the window if you want," she said with a smile. Lorenzo's face lit up. "Really? Thanks, Aunt Belinda." He scrambled into the seat, pressing his face against the small oval window. The view from up here was incredible. The ground below looked like a patchwork of tiny buildings and roads, the airport terminal shrinking into the distance. As the plane began to fill up, Belinda settled into the middle seat beside him, organizing their bags and sorting out snacks. The elderly woman sitting next to them, Mrs. Willow, gave them a warm smile as she settled into her seat. "Hello there," Mrs. Willow greeted, her silver hair gleaming in the cabin lights. "Looks like we'll be neighbors for this flight." Lorenzo turned shyly to her and smiled back. "Hi, I'm Lorenzo. This is my first time flying." Mrs. Willow's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Well, you're in for quite an adventure, young man," she said, her voice gentle and comforting. "I'm Mrs. Willow, and don't worry, I still get butterflies in my stomach every time I fly, even after all these years." Lorenzo's eyes widened. "Really? I thought it was just me." Mrs. Willow chuckled softly. "Oh no, dear. It's perfectly normal. But just think, in a few hours, you'll be with your dad. That'll make all this feel worth it." Lorenzo felt a tiny spark of excitement, pushing aside some of his nervousness. He could do this. He would see his dad again, and maybe things would feel better after all. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Lorenzo pressed his cheek against the cool window, his wide eyes watching the world below shrink into a patchwork of roads and buildings. The excitement from earlier, the thrill of finally flying, slowly began to fade into nervousness again. The noise of the engines filled his ears, and the world outside blurred into nothingness as the plane soared higher. It was surreal, the way everything looked from up here. The airport below looked like a toy set, the cars zipping along the tiny roads like ants on a trail. The sky outside had a soft glow to it, the pale blue turning slowly into the deep, endless expanse that stretched in every direction. For a moment, he felt like he was part of something much bigger than himself. The sensation of weightlessness, of floating above the ground, was both exhilarating and calming in a strange way. "Looks beautiful, doesn't it?" Belinda's voice broke through his thoughts. She had settled into her seat next to him, her hands busy adjusting the seatbelt and organizing their belongings. Her face was relaxed, calm as ever, but Lorenzo could tell she was keeping an eye on him, aware of his nervousness. "Yeah," Lorenzo replied quietly, glancing up at her. "It's amazing. But it also feels kinda strange." Belinda smiled warmly, giving him a quick, reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "It's normal to feel like that. This is a big change for you, and it can be a little overwhelming. But we're doing it together." Lorenzo nodded, but deep down the weight in his chest still didn't lift. It wasn't just the flight that was bothering him. It was everything that had happened before. The incident with the flight attendant replayed in his mind over and over again. The harsh words, the stares, the embarrassment. He hadn't done anything wrong, but it still felt like he had been cast out for reasons beyond his control. The way people had whispered, looked away, and avoided eye contact made him feel smaller than he already did. It wasn't just about being kicked off the plane anymore, it was the way people treated him. And the worst part? It seemed like no one had cared enough to step in. As his mind wandered, he heard a soft voice beside him. Mrs. Willow, the elderly woman seated on the other side of the aisle, had turned toward him. Her warm smile was comforting, like a beacon in the sea of strangers around them. "How are you doing, dear?" Mrs. Willow asked, her voice gentle. "First time flying can be a bit much, can it?" Lorenzo hesitated, then nodded, offering a small smile. "It's a lot to take in. But I think I'm okay." "You're handling it very well," Mrs. Willow said, her tone full of admiration. "You remind me of my grandson, though he's a bit younger. Always with his nose in a book, like you." Lorenzo's heart warmed at the mention of a grandson, and he smiled a little more. "Yeah, I like to read a lot," he admitted, reaching into his backpack to pull out a book he had packed for the trip. "I was just about to start reading before all this happened." Mrs. Willow's eyes twinkled. "Well, that's the perfect way to pass the time. Books take you places, don't they?" Lorenzo nodded enthusiastically, opening his book. "Definitely. It's like you can forget everything for a while and just get lost in the story." Before Mrs. Willow could respond, the flight attendants began making their rounds, checking seatbelts and ensuring everyone had everything they needed. Lorenzo's mind wandered again, and for a brief moment he forgot about his earlier embarrassment. The idea of escaping into a good story was just what he needed. As the plane continued its ascent, a few more passengers settled into their seats, some chatting quietly while others put on headphones preparing for the long flight. The hum of the engines became a soft background noise, lulling Lorenzo into a momentary sense of peace. But that peace was shattered the moment the flight attendants approached their row. One of them, a young woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude, walked down the aisle, her gaze scanning the cabin. She paused when she saw Lorenzo and Belinda, her eyes narrowing slightly before she glanced at the worn backpack Lorenzo had placed under his seat. A flicker of judgment crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Lorenzo felt her eyes on him, but he didn't understand why. Had he done something wrong? Did she think they didn't belong in first class? Belinda, noticing the flight attendant's gaze, gave Lorenzo's hand a reassuring squeeze. But just as she opened her mouth to say something, the attendant approached their row. "Can I help you with anything?" she asked curtly, her tone polite but distant. Belinda smiled up at her, maintaining her usual friendly demeanor. "No, thank you. We're all set. Just making sure Lorenzo's comfortable." The attendant nodded once but didn't smile back. She simply turned and continued down the aisle, her movements stiff and mechanical. But as she passed, she glanced back at them, a look of mild disapproval in her eyes. Lorenzo's stomach turned. What was that about? He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the weight of the attendant's gaze on him even after she had moved on. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just his imagination running wild, but it felt like the woman had judged them. Maybe it was the way they looked, his scuffed sneakers, his t-shirt, his aunt's messy hair. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the flight attendant had looked at them, like they didn't belong. Belinda noticed his discomfort and leaned closer to him, her voice soft. "Are you okay, kiddo?" Lorenzo hesitated, then shrugged, not sure how to put his feelings into words. "I don't know. It's just weird." She looked at us like we didn't belong. Belinda's expression softened with understanding. "I get it," she said quietly. "Sometimes people make judgments based on how others look or dress. But that doesn't define you, Lorenzo. You belong here just as much as anyone else." Lorenzo nodded, though his mind was still racing. He wanted to believe her, but the sting of the flight attendant's glance lingered. It made him wonder. How many times had he been judged for things that didn't matter? How many people had looked at him the same way? But before he could dwell on the thought, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their altitude and the expected time to arrival. Lorenzo glanced out the window again, trying to focus on the view, the shifting clouds below, the endless blue sky. Maybe he could find peace in the sky, where everything seemed so small and distant. But even as the plane continued its flight, the feeling of being out of place lingered, gnawing at him like a quiet whisper. Something wasn't right, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was going to be more complicated than he had hoped. Lorenzo's excitement began to fade the longer they were in the air. It wasn't the flight that bothered him, nor the view of the world below, but something in the atmosphere, a strange tension that had begun to linger. As the plane leveled out and the crew settled into their routines, the small nagging feeling that had been creeping up on him since the first incident earlier kept him on edge. His thoughts kept circling back to the flight attendant's eyes on them, the subtle judgment, the way she had walked by their row without a second glance. Why did she look at us like that? Lorenzo couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like they didn't belong, like their presence on the plane was somehow an inconvenience. Was it the way we dressed? Was it the way Aunt Belinda looked? He glanced at her sitting beside him, her calm demeanor as usual, but even she seemed a little tense, more on alert than she had been when they first boarded. Belinda noticed his fidgeting, his nervous glances, and her voice, soft but concerned, broke through his spiraling thoughts. "You doing all right, kiddo?" she asked gently, her eyes soft as she turned toward him. There was a tenderness in her voice, a subtle but important cue that she understood something was troubling him. Lorenzo hesitated before answering, his fingers playing with the edges of his seatbelt. "I don't know. I keep thinking about what happened earlier. The way she looked at us, Aunt Belinda. Like we didn't belong here." Belinda's expression tightened, but she quickly masked it with a soft smile. "Hey, I get it. Sometimes people make assumptions based on what they see. But you and I both know that doesn't mean a thing." She placed a reassuring hand on his, her touch warm and steady. "You belong just as much as anyone else. We all do." Lorenzo nodded but still couldn't shake the feeling. He turned back to the window, watching the soft clouds drift by, the endless sky stretching out before him. He tried to distract himself, to focus on something else, but his mind kept wandering back to the interaction. It wasn't just that one moment. It was the subtle shifts he had noticed since they boarded, the way people looked at them, the judgment that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible cloud. The flight attendant's gaze had been a quiet reminder of how different they were. Different in the way they looked, different in the way they dressed. Belinda had always told him that clothes didn't matter, that it was what was inside that counted. But in that moment, when the flight attendant gave them that quick, almost dismissive glance, Lorenzo began to wonder if maybe it did matter. Maybe it wasn't just about clothes or appearance. Maybe it was the way people saw them, the way they didn't quite fit in with the others. And yet, what was he supposed to do about it? He was just a kid. He couldn't control how people saw him or how they treated him. The thought of that was suffocating, the weight of being constantly judged, like the world was watching him, waiting for him to fail. Just then, the flight attendant from earlier, Stephanie, appeared again. She was making her way down the aisle, checking on passengers and collecting drink orders. Lorenzo's heart skipped a beat as she approached their row, and the uneasy feeling in his stomach returned. His breath hitched as he watched her, his fingers gripping the armrest as she drew closer. Belinda seemed to notice the change in his demeanor. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, though she subtly shifted her position, placing herself slightly between Lorenzo and the approaching attendant. The tension in the air was palpable now, like a quiet standoff that no one wanted to acknowledge. The moment Stephanie reached their row, she paused, her eyes scanning over them briefly before she spoke, her voice polite but cold. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her tone flat and impersonal, like she was merely going through the motions. Belinda smiled warmly, trying to ease the tension. "No, thank you. We're all set for now." Stephanie nodded curtly, her eyes flicking briefly to the worn backpack at Lorenzo's feet. The smallest flicker of disapproval crossed her face, almost imperceptible, but Lorenzo caught it. It didn't make sense. Why was she looking at their belongings like that? Why was she looking at them like that? Before he could voice his thoughts, Stephanie moved on, continuing down the aisle without another word. Lorenzo's breath escaped in a quiet rush and his hands trembled slightly in his lap. He felt like his heart was thudding in his chest, too loud for his own comfort. "Are you okay?" Belinda asked again, her voice soft but probing now, her concern genuine. She noticed the change in his body language, how tense he had become. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a comforting whisper. "Lorenzo, if something's bothering you, you need to tell me." Lorenzo wanted to speak, wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he had been holding on to something for so long that he was afraid to let go of it. It felt too heavy, too real. "She looked at us again," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like she doesn't think we belong here." Belinda exhaled slowly, and for a moment there was silence between them, heavy and full of understanding. "Lorenzo, sometimes people make assumptions about others based on how they look, what they wear, or where they're from. But that's not your fault, and it doesn't change who you are or where you belong." Lorenzo nodded, but the weight of it all still pressed down on him. He wanted to believe her, truly, but the sting of being judged in that way, the feeling of being an outsider, lingered. It was like a shadow following him wherever he went, a quiet reminder that he didn't always fit in. Before he could speak again, Mrs. Willow, who had been sitting quietly beside them, turned toward them with a warm smile. "You know, dear," she said, her voice low and kind, "I've been flying for years, and I still get those looks sometimes. People judge you without knowing a thing about you. But let me tell you something. Those people don't matter." Lorenzo looked at her, his confusion evident. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Willow chuckled softly, her eyes crinkling in amusement. "What I mean is that those people, the ones who judge and stare, they don't know you. They don't know your story, your heart, your worth. And their opinions? Well, they're not worth your time. You don't need to fit into their mold." Lorenzo's heart lifted slightly at her words. Mrs. Willow's kindness, her wisdom, filled him with a strange sense of peace. Maybe Belinda was right. Maybe these strangers didn't matter. Maybe it wasn't about them fitting him into some mold of what they thought was right. Maybe it was about him being true to who he was. As the conversation with Mrs. Willow continued, the tension in Lorenzo's chest started to ease. He took a deep breath, letting her words sink in, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. For the first time since the flight began, he felt like he could breathe again. He turned to Belinda, offering her a small but genuine smile. "I think I understand," he said, his voice steadier now. "I can't control how they see me, but I can control how I see myself." Belinda smiled, her eyes soft with pride. "Exactly, Lorenzo, exactly." Lorenzo couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Despite the moment of calm Mrs. Willow had provided, the underlying tension lingered. It wasn't just the flight attendant, Stephanie, or the stares from other passengers. It was the sense that everything they had just experienced, everything they had been through, wasn't going to end quietly. He was starting to feel like he was part of something bigger, something that was rapidly spinning out of his control. The plane's engines hummed softly, a rhythmic background noise that might have been comforting if it weren't for the events that kept replaying in Lorenzo's mind. His thoughts were clouded with the humiliation from earlier, the shock of being thrown off a flight for doing nothing wrong. Every so often he would catch Belinda's eyes, her gaze filled with the same quiet concern that made him feel safe. She never said much, but the way she watched him, always alert, always steady, told him that she wasn't about to let this slide. Lorenzo knew Belinda wasn't the type to let things go, but part of him, an unfamiliar part, was starting to worry about the consequences of pushing back. What if they were wrong? What if they were the ones causing a problem? It wasn't long before the silence around them grew unbearable. Just as he was starting to sink back into the haze of his thoughts, the familiar, sharp voice of the flight attendant cut through the quiet. "Everyone, please fasten your seatbelts. We'll be starting our descent soon." Lorenzo's heart skipped a beat. The plane was descending, and he still couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like the calm before a storm. He had hoped that by the time they landed, things would be behind them, an embarrassing, fleeting moment they could forget. But as the minutes ticked by, he felt a knot form in his stomach. The longer they stayed in the air, the more he could sense that this wasn't going to end with a simple apology. Belinda looked at him, her face unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she knew exactly what was coming. The tension was thick enough to slice through. Her hand found his again, and she gave it a gentle squeeze. "Lorenzo," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet resolve, "I want you to know, no matter what happens, we're going to get through this. This isn't over." Her words did little to ease the knot in his chest, but the fact that she was still so calm, so sure, gave him the smallest bit of comfort. Lorenzo nodded, trying to gather his courage. He trusted Belinda. She had always been his rock, the person who could make him feel safe even when the world felt like it was crumbling. But the reality of what was unfolding, the threat of being escorted off the plane again, seemed too much for a kid his age to handle. Why is this happening? His mind spiraled. Before he could get lost in his thoughts again, Stephanie, the same flight attendant who had caused all the trouble earlier, reappeared. This time she wasn't making polite requests or simply collecting drink orders. Her eyes were steely, her movements deliberate. She was walking toward them again, her gaze focused. This time there was no pleasantry in her voice. "I've spoken with the captain," she announced, her words cutting through the calm of the cabin like a knife. "You need to leave the plane, immediately." Lorenzo's breath caught in his throat. His whole body went rigid, and he felt his heart thundering in his chest. Was this really happening again? After everything? "Excuse me?" Belinda's voice rang out clear and firm. She had stood up quickly, her body angled protectively toward Lorenzo, as if to shield him from what was coming. "You're kicking us off the plane again?" Stephanie's eyes flickered with a mix of indifference and irritation. "I don't want to repeat myself," she said flatly, her voice rising slightly. "You two have caused enough disruption. If you can't behave properly, then you need to leave the aircraft." Belinda's jaw clenched, but she remained calm, refusing to let her emotions betray her. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice low but steady. "My nephew has done nothing wrong. He simply reached for his book." The words hung in the air, but there was no shifting Stephanie's gaze. The other passengers were starting to murmur, exchanging looks of uncertainty, some of them casting sympathetic glances at Lorenzo and Belinda, but no one spoke up. It was as if they, too, were afraid to say the wrong thing. The silence was deafening. Lorenzo felt his hands tremble, his grip tightening on the armrest. The pressure in his chest mounted. This was real. This was happening. How could they do this? The flight attendant raised her voice, making the whole cabin turn their attention to them. "I'm going to get security," she announced, her words directed toward Belinda and Lorenzo, but loud enough for everyone else to hear. "If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have them remove you." Lorenzo's heart dropped. He could feel the eyes of every passenger on him, all of them watching, none of them speaking. A chill ran down his spine. He wanted to scream, to protest, but the words felt stuck in his throat. The humiliation, the confusion, it was all too much. Belinda didn't back down. "This is unjust," she said firmly. "You can't treat us like this." Just then, 2 security officers appeared at the front of the plane. They weren't in a hurry, but their presence made everything feel more real. The entire cabin seemed to go quiet, and the eyes of the other passengers followed the security officers as they made their way toward them. Lorenzo's heart raced, his breath shallow. He could feel the tears starting to prick the backs of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. The security officers came closer, and one of them, tall, with a stern expression, spoke first. "Ma'am," he said, his voice professional but firm, "we've been instructed to escort you and your nephew off the plane." Lorenzo felt a lump form in his throat. He looked up at Belinda, searching her face for some reassurance, but her gaze was filled with quiet resolve, her body language exuding a sense of calm that she was trying to pass on to him. She was a warrior in that moment, standing tall against the world. "Are you sure this is necessary?" Belinda asked, her voice unwavering. "We haven't done anything wrong. There's no reason to remove us from this plane." The officer didn't answer right away. He just nodded at his partner, who moved to gather their belongings. "We're being removed from the flight," Belinda said, her voice now steely with a mix of disbelief and anger. "This is discrimination, and I won't stand for it." The security officer didn't respond. He simply waited, his stance stiff and unyielding. The entire cabin had fallen into a tense silence, and Lorenzo couldn't help but feel like a part of the entire world had just tilted. He felt like he was floating, detached, as if everything happening around him was a dream, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to wake up. As they walked down the narrow aisle toward the door, the whispers of the other passengers began to grow louder. Some exchanged words of concern. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Lorenzo kept his eyes on the floor, trying to keep his composure, but the weight of the stares, the pitying glances, it was too much. Lorenzo felt like the world was spinning out of control. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as the security officers led him and Aunt Belinda down the narrow aisle of the plane. The footsteps of the officers seemed to echo in his ears, each step heavier than the last. It felt like time was stretching, like every second lasted a lifetime. Every glance from the other passengers stung, their eyes following him and Belinda as they walked toward the exit, silent judgment in the air. Lorenzo wanted to disappear. The weight of the humiliation was unbearable, pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. What had he done wrong? Nothing. He had simply reached for his book. Yet somehow, in the eyes of the flight attendant and now these security officers, he had become the problem. He had become the reason for the disruption, the reason for all this chaos. Aunt Belinda walked beside him, her posture straight, her head held high, but Lorenzo could tell by the way her jaw tightened and the faint flicker of anger in her eyes that this wasn't over. She wasn't going to let this slide. He could feel her quiet strength beside him, but it didn't erase the crushing sense of injustice that hung over them both. The officers guided them to the exit, their expressions cold, impassive. Lorenzo caught sight of a few passengers glancing at them. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared unsure, and a few even seemed uncomfortable avoiding eye contact. But no one spoke up. Not one person said a word. It was like the whole plane was holding its breath, waiting for them to leave. The silence was suffocating. Once they reached the door, the officers motioned for them to step outside, and Belinda paused for just a moment. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes soft but filled with a quiet determination. "It's okay," she whispered to him. "I'm not going to let this go." Lorenzo nodded, his heart heavy in his chest, but the words didn't come. He wanted to tell her how scared he was, how embarrassed he felt, how he couldn't believe what was happening. But he couldn't find the words. The reality of it all was too much. Instead, he just stood there, watching as the officers made way for them to leave the plane. As they stepped off the aircraft and into the small, empty hallway leading to the terminal, the door to the plane closed behind them with a heavy thud. The finality of it felt like a punch to the gut. They were out, kicked off, humiliated. and there was nothing they could do about it, at least not in that moment. Aunt Belinda turned to him, her face a mask of calm, but Lorenzo could see the fire behind her eyes. "Come on," she said gently, guiding him by the hand. "Let's get our things and figure out what comes next." "We're not done yet." Lorenzo looked at her, his lips trembling. "What are we going to do?" His voice was barely above a whisper, his throat tight with emotion. "They just kicked us off the plane, Aunt Belinda. How can we fix this? How can we make it right?" Belinda gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to make this right, Lorenzo. We're not giving up. What they did was wrong, and we're going to stand up for ourselves. We're going to fight." As they walked through the terminal, Lorenzo couldn't help but feel the eyes of the other travelers on them. The whispers had already started. He could hear snippets of conversation as they passed. People were talking about them, about him. Some of it sounded sympathetic, but most of it felt judgmental, even if no one said anything outright. They had seen the commotion. They had seen what happened on the plane, and now they were all witnesses to the aftermath. Belinda kept walking with purpose, never faltering in her stride. She wasn't going to let this defeat them. She wasn't going to let this moment define who they were. Lorenzo admired her for that, but it didn't stop the gnawing ache in his stomach. He still didn't understand why they were being treated this way. He had done nothing wrong, yet here they were, stranded in the airport, their plans disrupted, their dignity torn apart by the actions of one flight attendant. When they reached the baggage claim area, Belinda let go of his hand and quickly called someone. Lorenzo watched as she spoke softly into the phone, her voice low and serious. She wasn't just calling for a ride home, she was calling to make sure this wasn't the end of the story. This wasn't the last chapter. He could see the fire in her eyes. The determination that he had always known was there, even though it had never been so evident before. Aunt Belinda had a way of making things happen. She was a force to be reckoned with. "All right, we'll be fine," she said as she hung up the phone. She turned to Lorenzo, her eyes softening for a moment as she reached for his hand. "I made a few calls. This isn't over. They're going to hear from us. They're going to hear from you." Lorenzo looked up at her, his confusion still clouding his thoughts. "What do you mean? How are we going to fix this?" Belinda's smile was small but resolute. "I'm going to make sure the airline understands what happened. We'll take legal action if we have to. But first, I need you to do something for me, Lorenzo." He looked up at her, uncertain. "What? Tell your story. Tell everyone what happened. Your voice is powerful. Your story is important. And people are going to listen. But you have to speak up, sweetheart. We can't let this go." Lorenzo hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over him. He could feel the sting of the earlier embarrassment still lingering. But there was a quiet strength in Belinda's words. She was right. He couldn't let this go. If he did, they would just sweep it under the rug. People needed to know what had happened. People needed to know the truth. "I'll do it," he said quietly, his voice filled with determination he hadn't felt before. "I'll tell them. I'll tell everyone." Belinda smiled, her eyes soft but proud. "I know you will, kiddo. You've already started something big." As they waited at the gate, Lorenzo's mind swirled with the weight of everything that had happened. The world around him felt distant, as if he were in a bubble, separated from the hustle and bustle of the airport. His thoughts were consumed by the injustice they had just faced, the unfair treatment, the public humiliation, and the utter disbelief that something so trivial had escalated into such an ordeal. His hands trembled as he clutched his backpack tightly, the familiar weight a small comfort amidst the chaos. Belinda, however, was still as composed as ever. She paced back and forth, speaking quietly into her phone, her voice low but firm. Lorenzo watched her, the steadiness in her movements a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside him. He admired her strength, her ability to remain calm and focused even when everything around them was crumbling. She had always been his rock, his protector, and now she was his beacon of hope in the midst of the turmoil. "I've made some calls," Belinda said after hanging up, her face unreadable but determined. "We're not done yet, Lorenzo. Not by a long shot." Lorenzo looked up at her, his voice small but filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "What are we going to do?" I just don't understand why this happened. We didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Belinda replied softly, her eyes locking with his. "But that's the thing, sweetheart. They don't get to define what's right and wrong here. We're not going to let them silence us. We're going to speak out. And you're going to help me." Lorenzo's eyes widened, his heart skipping a beat. "How? What can I do?" Belinda knelt down in front of him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "You've already done something by standing up for yourself, by not backing down. But now, we need to take it further. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We need to make sure people know what happened to us. And that's where your voice comes in." Lorenzo felt a knot form in his stomach. My voice? The thought seemed both daunting and empowering at the same time. He had never thought of himself as someone with a powerful voice. He was just a kid. But as he looked into Belinda's eyes, he could see the unwavering belief she had in him. She wasn't just asking him to speak up. She was counting on him. "I don't know if I can do it," he whispered, the doubt creeping into his voice. "What if people don't listen? What if they just think we're making it up?" Belinda's expression softened, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know it's scary. It's not easy to speak out, especially when you feel like no one's listening. But Lorenzo, your story matters. Your experience matters. You might be young, but your voice is powerful. You can make people see things differently. You can make them realize that what happened to us is not okay." Lorenzo swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. Could he really do it? Could he be the one to stand up and demand change? To make sure no one else had to go through what they had just endured? Before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from his mom. The moment he saw her name pop up on the screen, a rush of relief flooded through him. He hadn't spoken to her since the incident on the plane, and the thought of hearing her voice brought comfort in the midst of all the uncertainty. Lorenzo quickly tapped the screen to open the message. "Mom, I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I saw what happened. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. I'm on my way to the airport right now. We're going to get through this together." Lorenzo felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected to hear from her so soon, but just knowing that she was coming to be with him made everything feel a little bit more bearable. It was a small reassurance, a flicker of light in the darkness. "I'm going to be okay, Aunt Belinda," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "I'm going to do it. I'm going to speak out." Belinda's face softened into a smile, her eyes glistening with pride. "That's my boy. I knew you had it in you." As they sat in the airport, waiting for the next flight and Lorenzo's mother to arrive, Belinda kept a steady eye on her phone, managing emails and messages while Lorenzo processed the whirlwind of emotions that had taken over his life. The incident with the flight attendant had shaken him to his core, but now, as the hours passed, he began to feel something different, a sense of purpose, a sense of empowerment. He wasn't just a victim in this story. He had a role to play in how it unfolded. His mom arrived at the airport, her face filled with worry but quickly replaced by a warm, comforting smile when she spotted him. She rushed over to them, kneeling down to pull him into a tight embrace. "I saw what happened," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Lorenzo. You're so strong. We're going to make sure no one else goes through what you did." Lorenzo felt a wave of relief wash over him as he clung to his mom, burying his face in her shoulder. The warmth of her embrace, the sound of her voice, filled him with a sense of comfort he hadn't realized he needed. "It's not over," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Aunt Belinda said I need to speak out. I need to tell people what happened." His mom pulled back slightly, cupping his face in her hands. "And you will, sweetheart. You'll be amazing. You've already started something big. People are going to listen. Your voice will make a difference." Lorenzo nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something he could do, something that needed to be done. Belinda stepped forward, her eyes full of pride and warmth. "We're all in this together, Lorenzo. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. We'll make sure people hear you." And so, in that moment, As the hours stretched on and the next leg of their journey awaited them, Lorenzo made a quiet vow to himself. He wasn't going to be silent anymore. He wasn't going to let the injustice of his experience fade away into nothingness. He would speak out, and he would make sure that no one else had to endure the same humiliation and mistreatment that he had. The days after the incident on the plane passed in a blur. Lorenzo and Belinda had managed to push through the shock of it all, but the emotional weight of the experience still lingered, pulling at him whenever he let his guard down. It was strange. Part of him had hoped that maybe the whole thing would fade into the background, that they could return to their lives without anyone remembering the humiliation. But deep down, Lorenzo knew that wasn't going to happen. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. Belinda, as always, was busy fighting for them behind the scenes, contacting lawyers and making sure they had all the right people on their side. But Lorenzo couldn't help but feel like an outsider to it all. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone the focus of an entire legal battle. He had never imagined that one simple incident could turn into something so big. But, as Belinda explained, this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something larger, something that could affect countless other people who had been unjustly treated. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Lorenzo said one evening, sitting on the couch with his knees pulled up to his chest. The weight of the situation seemed heavier now, like it was finally sinking in. Belinda, who had been pacing the room, stopped and sat down beside him. Her voice was gentle but filled with an intensity that he had come to recognize. "Lorenzo, it's okay to be scared. You don't have to be ready right now. But the truth is, you've already started something by sharing your story. And you've given people who've been silent for too long a voice. This is bigger than us." Lorenzo glanced up at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "But how can I do this? How can I speak out when I don't even understand why it happened to us? Why did she treat us like that? What did we do?" Belinda reached over and placed her hand on his. "You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't ask for any of this, and neither did I. But sometimes the world asks us to stand up, even when it feels like we're not ready. And when we do, we make it easier for others to stand up too. We show them that their voices matter, even when the world tries to silence them." Lorenzo bit his lip, his eyes drifting to the window as he stared out at the world beyond. The streets below seemed so far away from the storm inside his head. He didn't know how to explain it, but everything felt so much heavier now. The idea of standing in front of people sharing his story, his pain, it terrified him. What if they didn't believe him? What if they thought he was exaggerating? What if they saw him as just a kid who didn't understand how the world worked? But Belinda's words echoed in his mind. "We make it easier for others to stand up." He had been the one to reach for his book on the plane. He had been the one to feel the sting of unfair treatment, to stand there humiliated and confused. And now he was going to be the one to fight back, not just for himself, but for all the others who had faced the same kind of injustice. The thought of that gave him a small glimmer of hope, a tiny flicker of something that felt like courage. The following morning, after much discussion and planning with Belinda, the decision was made. Lorenzo would speak at a public forum, sharing his story with the world. It would be streamed online with thousands of people watching. News outlets had already picked up the story, and his interview had gone viral. The platform was now his to use, to share the truth of what had happened to them. Lorenzo's heart raced as the day of the speech approached. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the passengers on that flight, their judgment, their whispers. He couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of being judged by people who didn't know him. But there was no turning back now. The morning of the speech, as they drove to the venue, Belinda looked over at him, her eyes filled with both pride and concern. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady. Lorenzo nodded, though it was more out of habit than confidence. "I think so." As they entered the venue, Lorenzo couldn't help but feel the weight of the eyes on him. Reporters, staff members, and other attendees had gathered, all of them focused on him. He tried not to let his nerves overwhelm him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the truth. It was about making sure the world knew what had happened and why it needed to change. When the time came for him to speak, his heart was in his throat. He stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edges, his palms slick with sweat. The microphone seemed too loud, amplifying the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. A deep breath. He could do this. Ladies and gentlemen. His voice cracked, but he steadied himself, drawing in another breath. I'm Lorenzo, and I'm here today because something happened to me that shouldn't have. My aunt and I were treated unfairly on a flight for no reason other than the way we looked. I was just a kid, trying to get my book, and I was told to get off the plane. He paused, taking a moment to let the words sink in. His hands were shaking, but he could feel something stirring inside him, something stronger than fear. I don't understand why it happened, he continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. But I know that it was wrong, and I'm not going to let anyone else be treated like that. We all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter how we look or where we come from. Lorenzo's words rang out in the room, echoing in the silence that followed. He could feel the eyes of the audience on him, but they didn't feel like judgment anymore. They felt like understanding. He could feel their support, their shared belief that what he was saying mattered. Belinda, standing beside him, gave him an encouraging nod, her eyes filled with pride. She had always known that Lorenzo had it in him. She had always known that his voice, his truth, was powerful. Lorenzo took another deep breath, his heart still racing but now with a different kind of energy. I'm telling my story because I want people to know that they don't have to be silent. When something is wrong, we have the right to speak up. We can make things better together. And that's what I want to do. Make sure this never happens again. He stepped back from the podium, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had just shared. The applause that followed was deafening, a roar of support that filled the room. Lorenzo stood there, his heart still racing, but this time with a sense of pride. He had done it. He had spoken out, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt voiceless. He had turned his fear into something powerful. And in that moment, he realized that he wasn't just a victim of what had happened on that plane. He was a catalyst for change. The days that followed Lorenzo's speech were a whirlwind. What had started as a single, heartfelt moment of standing up for himself and Aunt Belinda had quickly turned into something much bigger. The video of his speech had gone viral, spreading across social media platforms, news outlets, and even television broadcasts. People everywhere had shared it, commented on it, and in some cases, shared their own stories of similar discrimination. It was overwhelming, but in a way that felt empowering. Lorenzo could feel the ripple effect as it spread far beyond the walls of the conference room where he had spoken. He was no longer just the kid who had been kicked off a plane. He was a symbol, a voice for all the people who had been treated unfairly, quietly silenced by the world around them. At first, the attention felt like a heavy burden on his shoulders. Every time his phone buzzed with a new notification or message, his stomach would tighten with anxiety. It was hard to process, hard to comprehend. People from all over the country were reaching out, sharing messages of support and gratitude. Some even sent us stories of their own experiences, stories that mirrored his own, of being judged or dismissed for reasons beyond their control. But there were also the critics. The comments on social media were filled with both support and condemnation. Some applauded Lorenzo for his bravery, calling him a hero. Others criticized him for causing a scene or making a big deal out of nothing. Those voices stung. They were louder than the supportive ones, harder to ignore, like a constant buzzing in the back of his mind. Lorenzo's phone buzzed again. He glanced down, half expecting another hateful comment, but this time it was something different. It was a message from his school teacher, Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson, Lorenzo, I just watched your speech. You did an incredible job. I'm so proud of you. Your bravery is inspiring. If you're interested, I'd love to have you come talk to my class about your experience and what you're doing to make a change. Let me know if that's something you'd be willing to do. Lorenzo's heart swelled with pride. Mrs. Johnson was one of his favorite teachers. She had always been kind to him, always made him feel like his thoughts mattered. The idea of speaking to her class made him feel nervous, but also hopeful. He was starting to see that maybe his voice could make a difference, not just in front of a crowd of strangers, but in his own community as well. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Belinda. "Hey, kiddo." Belinda's voice came through the speaker, warm and steady, just like it always was. "How are you holding up?" Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of his phone. "It's a lot," he admitted. "I keep getting messages. Some of them are nice, but others, they're just mean. It feels like it's all too much sometimes." Belinda's voice softened. "I know it's overwhelming, but you're doing something really important. You've already made a difference just by speaking out. And those people who are being mean, they don't matter. What matters is the change you're starting. You're giving people the courage to stand up, too." Lorenzo nodded, though Belinda couldn't see him. The doubt still lingered, but her words brought him some comfort. "I guess so," he said quietly. "But what if it doesn't work? What if nothing changes?" "It already has," Belinda replied firmly. "The fact that you're speaking up, that people are listening, that's change. It's going to ripple out and make a difference in ways we can't even see yet." Lorenzo let out a deep breath, still uncertain but slowly starting to believe her. He had never imagined that his story would reach so many people, let alone inspire a movement. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in something much bigger than he had ever planned for. But as the days went by, something began to shift. He started receiving messages not just from strangers but from his classmates and friends, people who had witnessed the event unfold and who were now standing by him. They thanked him for showing them that it was okay to speak up, that it was okay to stand up for what was right. They didn't see him as just a victim anymore. They saw him as someone who had taken control of his story and made it his own. One afternoon, after school, Lorenzo met up with his best friend, Alex. He had been reluctant to talk to him at first, unsure of how Alex might react to all the attention. But when he saw Alex waiting for him outside, his usual grin on his face, Lorenzo felt a small sense of relief. Alex looked him up and down, then smiled. "Hey man, I just wanted to tell you, I'm really proud of you. You were awesome in that interview. I can't believe you did that." Lorenzo felt his cheeks flush. "It wasn't that big of a deal. I just told the truth." Alex shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, dude. It was a big deal. You stood up to all those people. You stood up to them and now everyone's talking about it. It's amazing." Lorenzo smiled faintly, feeling the weight of Alex's words settle inside him. Maybe it wasn't such a big deal, but maybe, just maybe, it was. The support from his friends, from people he knew and trusted, made all the difference. They were starting to see him differently, not as the kid who had been humiliated, but as the one who had risen above it. As the weeks passed, the impact of Lorenzo's words continued to spread. Social media campaigns were launched, urging airlines to address discrimination and to improve their training for staff. News outlets picked up the story, and legal professionals reached out to offer their help. The ripple effect was real, and it was only growing. Lorenzo found himself speaking at local schools, sharing his story with classmates and teachers alike. He even went on a local news segment, his voice steady as he spoke about the injustice he had faced and how everyone had a responsibility to stand up for what was right. Each time he spoke, he felt more and more confident, less like the scared kid he had been at the start of the journey. Through it all, Belinda remained by his side, guiding him with her quiet strength, helping him navigate the overwhelming world of social media, news interviews, and legal action. But it wasn't just Belinda who had his back. It was everyone who had seen his story, everyone who had shared their own experiences, everyone who had stood up in their own way because of the courage Lorenzo had shown. By the time the airline had publicly apologized and announced a series of changes, Lorenzo felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The battle wasn't over, but the world had started to shift in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had done it. They had done it. "Look at that," Belinda said one evening, pointing to the screen. "The airline has issued an apology. They're going to change their policies, starting with mandatory training for all employees." Lorenzo watched, his heart swelling with pride. He had started something that couldn't be undone. He had been the spark, and now the fire was spreading, slowly but surely. "This is just the beginning," Belinda said softly, her voice filled with pride. "You've already changed the world, and it all started with you." Lorenzo smiled, finally understanding what she meant. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been unfairly treated, everyone who had felt powerless. He had helped start a movement, a ripple that would continue to grow, one voice at a time. The days after the airline's apology felt like a blur. The legal battles continued, but Lorenzo couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment as he saw the changes unfolding. The airline had not only apologized, but they had also implemented mandatory diversity training for all employees. They had set up scholarships for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation. Lorenzo had been part of something bigger than himself, something that would change the way people were treated on planes forever. As news of the airline's actions spread, more and more people came forward to share their own stories of discrimination in the airline industry. Social media campaigns and petitions grew, demanding that other companies follow suit. Lorenzo's courage had sparked a wave of change, and it was clear now that this wasn't just about one flight or one boy, it was about an entire movement. Lorenzo, for the first time since the incident, began to feel proud of himself. The pressure had been immense, and there were moments when he had doubted himself, when he had questioned whether he was doing the right thing. But now, as he saw the change unfolding, he knew it had been worth it. Belinda had been his rock throughout it all, her constant support never wavering. She had always believed in him, always pushed him to use his voice for something greater than just himself. "You did this, Lorenzo," she had told him one evening as they sat together. "You started a conversation that needed to be had, and now people are listening." Lorenzo smiled, the weight of the past few weeks lifting off his shoulders. "I didn't do it alone, Aunt Belinda," he said quietly. "I had you, and I had everyone who stood by me." Belinda hugged him tightly. "That's the truth, kiddo. It's always about the people who support you. And now we're all part of something that's bigger than any one of us." Lorenzo stood at the front of the classroom a few days later, addressing a group of his peers. He was nervous at first, but when he saw the faces of the students, their eyes wide with attention and respect, his confidence grew. He spoke about what had happened to him, what he had learned, and the importance of standing up for what was right. "This isn't just about me," Lorenzo said, his voice steady. "It's about all of us. It's about standing up against injustice, no matter how big or small. When we stand together, we can make a difference." The students applauded, and for the first time in a long time, Lorenzo felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. It wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. But Lorenzo knew deep down that he had made a real difference, and that feeling, that spark of change, was all that mattered. The weeks that followed felt like a turning point for Lorenzo. As he continued to share his story with others, the ripple effect only grew stronger. Schools, community groups, and even businesses reached out to him, wanting to learn from his experience and make changes in their own environments. It was as though his voice had started a chain reaction, one that reached far beyond what he had ever imagined. Despite all the attention and the outpouring of support, Lorenzo stayed grounded. He knew that this journey wasn't just about him anymore. It was about creating lasting change. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. But more than that, it was about helping others find their voices too. One afternoon, Lorenzo and Belinda sat in the living room, the weight of the past few months still lingering in the air, but with a sense of peace settling between them. Lorenzo had just finished another interview with a local news station, his nerves now a distant memory. "You did great today," Belinda said, smiling at him from across the room. "You're becoming a real advocate, Lorenzo." Lorenzo nodded, though he could still feel the nerves creeping in. "I don't know if I'll ever get used to all this attention." But it feels good to know that people are listening, that maybe things are actually changing. Belinda's smile softened and she placed a hand on his shoulder. It's all thanks to you. You were brave enough to speak up, and now others are following your lead. Lorenzo thought about her words, the weight of them sinking in. He had always been a quiet kid, someone who liked to blend in. But now, he was finding strength in his own voice, in his ability to speak out for others who couldn't. Later that week, Lorenzo spoke at a youth empowerment event. As he stood on stage, he realized that speaking out had changed him. It had taught him the importance of standing up for others, even when it felt uncomfortable. And in the process, he had discovered something about himself. He wasn't just the kid who had been treated unfairly. He was the one making a difference. He was the one helping others find their courage. The applause from the audience felt different this time, not as a validation of his actions, but as a celebration of the change he had helped inspire. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever felt voiceless, everyone who had ever been silenced by injustice. As the event came to a close, Lorenzo walked off the stage with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know where this journey would take him next, but he knew that it was only the beginning. The change he had sparked was just starting to gain momentum, and he was determined to see it through. For the first time in a long while, Lorenzo felt certain about one thing. He had found his voice, and he was never going to let it go. The world seemed different now. For Lorenzo, each day brought new opportunities, new challenges, and new faces. His journey, which had started with a humiliating incident on a plane, had grown into something far greater than he ever anticipated. People from across the country, some who had shared similar experiences, others who were simply moved by his story, had reached out to him, expressing their gratitude and admiration. As he sat in the quiet of his room one evening, Lorenzo reflected on how much had changed. He had gone from being a kid who was unsure of his place in the world to someone who was actively creating change. He had learned that his voice mattered, that standing up for what was right could make a difference. He had learned that even when the world seemed unjust, one person could still make an impact. Belinda, as always, had been by his side through it all. She had been his anchor, his constant source of strength and encouragement. Her belief in him never wavered, even when he doubted himself. She had shown him that true change came from within, from the willingness to stand firm, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. "It's hard to believe how far we've come," Lorenzo said to her one evening, looking up from the papers he had been reviewing. "Sometimes it feels like everything's moving so fast." Belinda smiled and nodded. "I know what you mean. But you've been the one leading this change, Lorenzo. You've turned something painful into a powerful movement." Lorenzo smiled faintly. "I never thought this would happen. I just wanted to go see my dad and have a normal trip. But now, it feels like I'm part of something bigger, like I have a purpose." "You do," Belinda said, her voice steady. "And that purpose is bigger than any one incident. You're showing people that their voices matter, that standing up for justice isn't just a one-time thing. It's a lifelong fight." Lorenzo nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He had realized something during this journey. Change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come without sacrifice. But the change he was part of, the ripple effect that had started with his story, was just the beginning. There was still so much to be done, so many people to help, so much to learn. As the weeks passed, Lorenzo's confidence grew. He continued to speak at local events, sharing his story with younger students who admired his courage. He became an advocate for social justice, working with organizations that aimed to raise awareness about discrimination in all forms. With Belinda by his side, he knew there was so much more he could accomplish, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Lorenzo didn't know exactly what the future held, but one thing was clear: he was ready for it. He had found his voice, and with it, he had the power to make real change. For the first time in a long while, Lorenzo felt at peace with himself. He was no longer defined by the injustice he had faced, but by the actions he had taken to change it. The world may have tried to silence him, but he was speaking louder than ever. The future awaited, and he was ready to meet it head-on. Months had passed since the events on the plane, and Lorenzo could finally look back at everything with a sense of pride. What had started as a simple act of standing up for himself had transformed into something far greater. His story was no longer just about a single moment of injustice. It had become a symbol of resilience, hope, and the power of speaking up. Lorenzo had become an advocate, not just for himself, but for countless others who had faced similar discrimination. He had spoken at schools, community events, and even appeared on national platforms. His message was always the same: don't stay silent. Your voice matters. Everywhere he went, he was met with applause and admiration. People were inspired by his bravery, by the way he had turned a painful experience into a force for change. But Lorenzo knew that the work wasn't finished yet. The road to justice was long, and even though his voice had sparked something big, there was still more to be done. One afternoon, as he sat at the kitchen table with Belinda, a letter arrived. The envelope was official-looking, and Lorenzo's heart skipped a beat as he opened it. "Lorenzo, I'm proud of you," the letter began. It was from the National Civil Rights Coalition, the very group that had reached out to them in the early days of the incident. "Your story has been heard, and we want to support you in the next step of your journey. We believe in your vision and would like to work together on future initiatives aimed at ending discrimination in all forms." Lorenzo looked up at Belinda, his eyes wide. "They want to work with me?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and excitement. Belinda smiled, her pride evident. "Looks like your voice is making even more of a difference than you realized." This letter was the confirmation that Lorenzo's story had grown into a movement. It wasn't just about changing policies at airlines anymore. It was about creating a world where discrimination in all forms could no longer be ignored. It was about using his platform to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced. As the days went on, Lorenzo's confidence continued to grow. He began working closely with the National Civil Rights Coalition, attending meetings and contributing his ideas for ways to bring more attention to the fight against discrimination. He was no longer just a kid who had been kicked off a plane. He was a leader in the movement for equality. In his heart, Lorenzo knew this wasn't the end of the journey. He had started something, but the fight for justice would always be ongoing. His legacy would be built on the idea that speaking up and standing together could change the world, one voice at a time. "I'm proud of you, Lorenzo," Belinda said one evening as they sat together. "You've done more than just stand up for yourself. You've created a legacy, one that will inspire generations to come." Lorenzo smiled, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He didn't need to be a hero. He didn't need to be famous. All he needed was the courage to speak his truth, and with that, he had sparked a wave of change that would ripple across the world for years to come. As he looked toward the future, Lorenzo knew that the fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The world was listening now, and he had no intention of staying silent.